Hey, welcome to Real Mob Stories. This is your host, James Proctor. Hope everyone's doing well. Today, I'm going to discuss what went on behind the scenes, which gave Tommy Reynolds his freedom. I had the opportunity to speak with a mob attorney this weekend who shared some interesting insights on what goes on with these so called compassionate releases and why some of these guys get their freedom while others they have much serious health issues and even older won't see the light of day outside the confines of the United States Bureau of Prisons. It's not a fair and just process, but by the end of today's show, we'll have a better understanding on what happens. Please do me a favor if you can and hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Without further delay, on to our feature presentation. So, when you start looking at these cases, when you're being considered for a compassionate release, the first thing they look at, obviously, is the case itself. The truth is that a nonviolent case gives you a better chance of release. You have the nonviolent drug offenders that are by far the most prevalent prisoner in the Bureau of Prisons, even today. The war on drugs in the 80s and 90s was a failure, and all it did was overcrowd the prisoners and lead to more violence and gangs in the prisons. And the governments realized their mistakes in regards to mass incarceration for nonviolent drug offenders, and these people have a better shot of getting out. Of course, Tommy Reynolds did a horrible deed by taking the life of an innocent woman, and to make matters worse, he was involved in up to 6 murders plus numerous assaults. What went in Tommy Reynolds' favor goes back actually to 2001. Instead of fighting the murder charges on Judy Shemtov or even accepting a global plea, Tommy Reynolds pled guilty. He really didn't have a choice as evidence was overwhelming. Plus, he had Chris Pazziello ready to testify against Tommy Reynolds. So Tommy Reynolds pled guilty, and the only agreement with the federal government would be that he would get a sentence that was something less than life. In this case, Chris Pazziello was looked at as the orchestrator of the attempted robbery on the Shemtovs. And it was Chris that found out about Samuel Shemtov, who was storing upwards of $1 million in a safe in his house. And this information actually came to Chris at a New Year's Eve party on December 31st, 1992. The murder itself took place a little over 6 weeks later on February 18th, 1993. Tommy Reynolds pled guilty in February of 2001 and actually had been in jail for all about 6 months since 1995. The initial sentence was life without the possibility of parole. However, the case was looked at again in 2004. So the judge reviewed the case and reduced it to 42 years because the prosecutors had told Tommy he would get a sentence of less than life if he just pled guilty. Pleading guilty saved the government money. It also ensured that Tommy would be behind bars. And I was told that there was an offer for Tommy Reynolds to become an informant where he would have gotten 6 years, but Tommy absolutely refused to rat. On that day of sentencing in 2001, Tommy Reynolds expressed remorse for what he did, and he said that he just hoped that one day he could be home with his children, and he regretted that he took the life of somebody that was not involved in that so-called life. So by admitting guilt and remorse and not fighting the case in court, it went in Tommy's favor when it was looked at for being released. One of the other major elements is how the incarcerated convict behaved in prison. So Tommy Reynolds has been a model prisoner from what I was told. He hasn't had any major disciplinary violations for many years. He's not displayed violent tendencies or been involved in drug use, gangs, or any of those things that the courts look negatively upon. He's also been involved in prison programs that are set up to help a convict enter back into society, like job programs, education, etc. Besides how Tommy Reynolds did his time in prison, the courts also look at his ability to live a life outside of crime. Apparently, Tommy Reynolds has a support system in place. And he has a place to go and loving family members willing to take him in. And he's also distanced himself from anything related to organized crime. One of the biggest issues for convicts that get released, especially for somebody that's been behind bars for nearly 30 years, is adjusting to the outside world. And, he agrees to supervise monitoring, drug tests, all of those things. So, he's going to be definitely under the eye of, the US government probably for the rest of his life. But when you look at the whole compassionate release statutes, nothing regarding these factors are mentioned. The original intent of compassionate release was for prisoners that had a terminal illness, they could go home to die instead of dying behind bars. However, this has been expanded the last few years to include when there are particularly extraordinary or compelling circumstances which couldn't be reasonably been foreseen by the court at the time of the sentencing. So the attorney I spoke with said that what really helped Tommy was having attorneys on his case with experience and understanding on how the compassionate release statutes used. Also, the help of Chad March did probably more than anything and anybody to get this release. As you know, the government is a bureaucratic animal and paperwork gets lost in the shuffle. You have to know the process, but also all the written and unwritten rules. The way you file the paperwork, along with what you state is the reason for the release, is critical. You see, many attorneys are great trial attorneys, but they don't have the expertise when it comes to these compassionate release cases. And the judges who decide these cases are at disadvantage because, they're bound by minimum sentencing guidelines. The other problem is that parole was abolished in the federal system. Back before the 1988 sentencing guideline changes, judges had more liberty to interpret the law when determining a sentence of punishment. Typically, a prisoner could also get out after 2/3 of a sentence. The prisoner would get other credits to shave the sentence down even further, and it was possible to get out, with around 60% of the original sentence. Also, a life sentence allowed a prisoner to get out after 30 to 35 years in the pre 1988 guidelines. And that's how the Gemini twins, Anthony Center and Joey Testa, got out. Even though their crimes were horrendous, the courts had no choice but to allow them parole based on the sentencing under those different guidelines. But today, a federal prisoner has to serve at least 85% of their sentence to get out. So when you look at Tommy Reynolds' case, his amended sentence was 42 years. But then in 2019, Reynolds went back to court asking for credit for time served where he had served a concurrent state sentence. So the court shaved 6 years off of the sentence to 36 years. And then based upon the 85% rule, he could have got out in 30 years, and that's where the 2030 release date came from for Tommy Reynolds. However, the compassionate release allowed Tommy to get out 5 or so years earlier than expected. When the attorney I spoke with explained this to me, it made sense to me, but I asked him why so many of these other guys that have obvious terminal conditions and are in their 80s and 90s, for example, they're never granted a compassionate release, even though common sense tells you that they're no longer a danger to the community. And this is what I was told. And what I was told that's hurting these other mob guys that we've spoken about previously in trying to get the compassionate release. So in most of these cases, the mobster, the quote unquote mob guy, pled not guilty and also went to trial. The mobster, the mob guy, never expressed remorse for the crimes that he was convicted of. In most cases, the accused never even testified in court in his own defense. And so the courts look at this negatively when it comes to a compassionate release. Tommy Reynolds did express remorse and, most importantly, pled guilty and let the courts decide his punishment. Another issue is that the judges typically want the mobster seeking compassionate release to admit being involved in the mafia and also renouncing that association. You see, most of these old timers aren't going to betray the oath of omerta by even admitting to the mob, so that's held against him. And next, one of the biggest barriers facing mob guys seeking release is that even though mobsters in the United States Bureau of Prisons typically are well behaved and model prisoners, they still associate with other known mob guys while in prison. And the thought is that these guys never renounce their affiliation with the mob and that once they get out, they're just going to go back to the life of crime, even though this really isn't the case in many instances. You can look at Gene Gotti, John Carnegie, and others who got out and they didn't go back into that life. But the courts have this prejudice that they held against Italian prisoners who are convicted of organized criminal charges. And what I was told is that the courts believe that most of these gangsters who get convicted of crimes actually had gotten away with dozens of more crimes. And why the case is that U.S. attorneys, they're looking, their goal is just for a conviction. If there are crimes that are harder to prove, they may not be included in the indictment. But the mindset is that the Italian gangsters did a lot more criminal acts than what they got convicted of. Also, there are many judges and prosecutors that think that Italian gangsters will abuse and take advantage of the system. And they'll find ways, for example, to make their particular medical condition appear worse and more life-threatening than it really is. But, that doesn't make any sense to me, especially when you look at Vic Orena. So Vic Orena is 90 years old and no longer a danger to society, and he's suffering from dementia and physical health problems. Why is he still in prison? Well, part of the issue, according to the attorney I spoke with, is that these high-profile cases like this are less likely to get a release. There's a tendency of the courts to be extra aggressive when it comes to organized crime. Organized crime is great for the Department of Justice when it comes to asking for money from Congress. And the reason you see so much media press when there's a mob bust is that's high profile and it grabs attention. But more than that, it helps to get more money to pay for more resources for the United States Department of Justice. For me personally, it's not right how the government is approaching compassionate release. It should be looked at individually for each case instead of lumping somebody in because they might have been in organized crime at one time. But that's the reality of it. Unfortunately, for men like Vic Orena, who were once part of the mafia, the chance of them getting a compassionate release is next to zero. Hopefully, I've been able to shed some light on the system and what goes on behind the scenes when it comes to compassionate release. As far as Tommy Reynolds go, his acts of violence, they're horrible. What he did to Judy Shemtov was not an accident, in my opinion. He made the decision to go to that house because he wanted to score a huge payday. For me personally, I think he should have stayed in prison until 2030. Do I think he's changed? I absolutely do. I've spoken with Chad Marks in the past about Tommy Reynolds and spoken with others who are around Tommy, and he's definitely not that same person he was when he was involved with the Bath Avenue crew. Personally, I don't think he's going to go back to a life of crime. It's just that I have a problem that he gets a release while other more deserving prisoners won't get that chance. Tommy's fortunate that he had Chad Marks as an advocate. Without Chad Marks, I don't think Tommy would have prevailed with the case. That's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. I really want to hear your comments on Tommy Reynolds and what you think about the current system of compassionate release. Do you think that the people who are associated with the mob are unfairly treated by the courts? What changes do you think we need in place to make compassionate release a fairer process? Until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.